The gray sedan appeared in Leora's peripheral vision exactly where it always did, 3 blocks from Ridgemont Elementary, slowing to match her walking pace. 7 consecutive afternoons had taught her to recognize the dull chrome bumper, the tinted windows that never fully revealed the driver's face, and the way it idled just close enough to feel like a shadow breathing down her neck. She clutched her backpack straps tighter, the weight of her math textbook suddenly feeling like armor against something she couldn't name. The September sun painted Lexington's sidewalks in warm amber, but cold dread settled in her stomach like stones sinking in deep water. The vehicle crept forward as she quickened her steps, maintaining that precise distance that wasn't quite illegal, but screamed wrongness into every fiber of her 7-year-old instincts. Other children laughed and chased each other down the street, oblivious to the predator moving through their afternoon like a shark through shallow waters. Leora had learned his pattern with the careful observation of prey studying a hunter. He never followed on Wednesdays when her mother picked her up, never appeared on rainy days when visibility was poor, and always disappeared before she reached the corner of Ashland Avenue where the neighborhood watch signs began. The driver smiled today. She caught the flash of teeth through the partially lowered window. Her name floated across the distance between them, spoken in a voice that tried too hard to sound friendly, and her blood turned to ice despite the warmth radiating from the pavement beneath her worn sneakers. She broke into a run, her backpack bouncing against her spine with each desperate stride. The car accelerated slightly, not enough to draw attention from the scattered adults watering lawns or retrieving mail, but enough to keep her within its sight like a cat toying with a cornered mouse. When she finally burst through her apartment building's door, chest heaving and tears threatening to spill, she knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow would bring the 8th afternoon. The pattern would continue, relentless and patient, because patterns like this didn't break themselves. They only intensified until something shattered. That evening, Leora sat across from her mother at their small kitchen table, trying to find words that would make Avelra understand. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made her mother's exhausted face look older than it should, the double shift at Mercy General Hospital having drained every reserve of energy. Avelra listened with the distracted attention of someone already mentally preparing for the next 12-hour workday. Her scrubs still smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and her hands moved on autopilot as she divided leftover casserole onto 2 mismatched plates that had survived 3 apartment moves. The words tumbled out in a rush. The gray car, the man who knew her name, the 7 days of being followed like a shadow she couldn't shake. Leora watched hope drain from her own chest as her mother's expression shifted from concern to something worse, polite skepticism mixed with parental reassurance that felt hollow, even as it was spoken. Avelra suggested coincidence, explained that Lexington wasn't a large city, and people often drove the same routes at the same times. She promised to call the school in the morning, to mention it to the crossing guard, to keep an eye out when her schedule allowed her to be home before dark descended. But Leora heard what wasn't being said, the unspoken truth that a tired single mother working 60-hour weeks couldn't protect against shadows that moved just outside the boundaries of proof. Fear was harder to treat than fever, and worry didn't respond to the same protocols as the patients who filled her mother's shifts with measurable emergencies. That night, Leora lay awake listening to Lexington's nighttime symphony, filtering through their apartment's thin walls. Sirens wailed in the distance. A dog barked 3 blocks over, and somewhere a car engine idled too long before finally pulling away, leaving silence that felt more threatening than the noise had been. She thought about the school counselor who had smiled with practiced patience when she'd reported the gray car, explaining that adults sometimes drove slowly in school zones, and that noticing the same vehicle didn't mean anything sinister. The police officer who'd visited the school for safety week had been even less helpful, suggesting she was confusing different cars that happened to be the same color. Nobody believed that a 7-year-old could accurately identify a threat, could read danger in the deliberate way someone learned your routine and inserted themselves into it. They all saw an imaginative child with an overactive sense of caution, not a girl whose survival instincts were screaming warnings that adult logic had learned to ignore. The ceiling fan rotated slowly above her bed, its shadow crossing her face in predictable intervals that should have been soothing, but instead reminded her of how patterns could become prisons. Tomorrow would bring the 8th afternoon, and the afternoon after that would bring the 9th, each one tightening the invisible net being woven around her daily journey home. She made a decision in that darkness, the kind of desperate choice that only makes sense when all reasonable options have failed. Lexington had rules, official ones written in law books and taught in schools, but it also had different rules, the kind that operated in spaces where official authority hadn't bothered to look, or had looked, and chosen to do nothing. The Corvell Transport Building rose from downtown Lexington like a monument to legitimate power, barely concealing something far more complex. Its facade of smoked glass and brushed steel reflected the afternoon sky in fragments, creating the illusion that the structure existed partially in another dimension, where different rules applied than those governing the coffee shops and law offices surrounding it. Leora had heard the name whispered in her apartment building's laundry room, caught between the spin cycle and the smell of fabric softener. Mrs. Brennan from 4C had mentioned it while folding towels, her voice dropping to that particular register adults used when discussing things children weren't supposed to understand, but somehow always did. The building's entrance intimidated even from across the street, with its revolving doors that moved with the smooth precision of expensive machinery and doormen who somehow managed to look both welcoming and absolutely capable of violence. Business people flowed in and out like blood through arteries, each one dressed in the uniform of legitimate enterprise. She waited until the 8th afternoon arrived exactly as predicted, the gray car appearing like clockwork 3 blocks from school. But instead of turning toward home, Leora walked in the opposite direction, toward the part of Lexington where buildings grew taller and the sidewalks filled with purposeful strangers who wouldn't notice one small girl moving against the current. The journey took 40 minutes at her walking pace, each block carrying her further from familiar territory into the polished heart of the city. Her backpack grew heavier with each step, and twice she almost turned back, almost convinced herself to try the official channels one more time, despite knowing they'd already failed her. The gray car didn't follow her downtown. She'd gambled correctly that whoever drove it wouldn't pursue her into areas with security cameras on every corner, and witnesses who might actually pay attention. But that small victory felt hollow, because tomorrow he'd be waiting again, and the next day, and the day after that, until something changed. Or something broke. She reached the Corvell building at 4:15, when the sun had begun its descent and cast long shadows across the plaza fronting the entrance. Business hours were winding down, the flow of people thinning but not yet stopped, creating a strange liminal period where the building existed between its day face and whatever it became after dark. Leora climbed the 3 granite steps leading to the entrance and sat down, her small form dwarfed by the scale of the architecture. She placed her backpack beside her like a companion, unzipped it, and pulled out her math homework as though she'd simply chosen this particular spot to complete assignments that were already overdue. Security guards in dark suits noticed her immediately. She caught their glances through the glass, saw them conferring with each other using the subtle hand signals of people trained to communicate without drawing attention. One spoke into his wrist, the gesture so smooth it looked casual. And Leora knew her presence had been reported to someone deeper inside the building's hierarchy. She kept her head down, pencil moving across the worksheet with mathematical precision that had nothing to do with the actual problems. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something you couldn't name, each minute stretching like taffy while simultaneously disappearing into a blur of held breath and mounting courage. An hour passed, then 2. The sun painted the glass building in shades of gold and crimson, before surrendering to twilight's purple-blue embrace. Businesses closed around her, their employees streaming past without sparing a glance for the child, who had somehow become part of the building's furniture through sheer persistent stillness. Her legs cramped from sitting, her stomach reminded her that lunch had been 6 hours ago, and doubt crept in with the evening chill that made her wish she'd worn something warmer than her thin school cardigan. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe the stories she'd overheard were just stories. Maybe she'd misunderstood everything and was now just a lost kid who'd wandered too far from home. Then the last car arrived, a black sedan with tinted windows that made the gray car look like a toy by comparison. It glided to the curb with the whisper-quiet confidence of engineering that cost more than her mother made in a year, and the building's energy shifted like air pressure dropping before a storm. The doorman who'd been casually monitoring her for the past 2 hours suddenly stood straighter, his hand moving to open the rear door before anyone inside could reach for the handle. Other security personnel materialized from positions she hadn't realized they'd been occupying, creating a loose perimeter that looked random but absolutely wasn't. Leora stood on trembling legs, her homework scattering in the evening breeze that chose that moment to gust through the plaza. She took 3 steps forward, her voice smaller than she'd intended, but somehow carrying across the space between desperate hope and her last option. The man who emerged from the black sedan wore darkness like some people wore cologne, not as an accessory, but as an essential component of his presence. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored to shoulders that suggested physical power held in careful reserve, and his face carried the kind of stillness that came from never needing to prove anything to anyone. Ryan Corville's eyes found her immediately, and Leora felt the weight of assessment that went beyond simply noticing. He looked at her the way her mother examined patients, with complete attention that catalogued every detail while revealing nothing of his conclusions, seeing past the surface to the story written in posture and desperation. The security team tensed as Leora approached, their bodies shifting into positions that could become barriers or interventions with minimal effort. But Ryan raised one hand in a gesture so subtle it barely qualified as movement, and they froze like statues, suddenly remembering they were carved from stone, not flesh with opinions. She stopped exactly 6 feet away, some instinct warning her that getting closer without permission would end this before it began. The distance felt vast and intimate simultaneously, a chasm crossed only by the words she had to somehow force past the fear lodged in her throat like a physical object. Up close, he was younger than the stories suggested, though age seemed irrelevant to whatever authority radiated from him, like heat from pavement after sunset. His hair was dark, touched with amber in the artificial light spilling from the building's lobby, and his expression revealed absolutely nothing. Not kindness, not cruelty, just patient attention. Leora's prepared speech evaporated like morning fog under scrutiny that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. She'd practiced the words during her walk downtown, rehearsed them while pretending to do homework, but now they seemed childish and insufficient for the reality standing before her in an expensive suit and shoes that probably cost more than 3 months of rent. Instead, the truth came out raw and unpolished, her voice cracking on the second word. She told him about the gray car, about the 7 afternoons that had become 8, about the man who smiled and knew her name, and made her afraid to walk home from school in a city that was supposed to be safe. She explained how the adults with official authority had nodded and dismissed her, how concern evaporated into platitudes about overactive imaginations and coincidental routes. Her words tumbled faster, as desperation overrode caution, spilling details about which streets the car appeared on and which it avoided, demonstrating that she'd documented her stalker with the thoroughness of someone who knew evidence was supposed to matter even when it didn't. Ryan listened without interrupting, his stillness absolute in a way that made every small gesture from others seem like frantic motion by comparison. He didn't check his watch, didn't glance at his security team, didn't display any of the impatient tells that usually meant adults had stopped actually hearing what children said. When she finally ran out of words, the silence stretched between them like a bridge that might hold weight or might collapse. Leora's hands twisted in the hem of her cardigan, pulling threads loose from seams that had already survived too many nervous moments, and she realized with sinking certainty that she'd gambled everything on a story she'd overheard in a laundry room. Then he spoke, his voice lower than she'd expected, and carrying an accent she couldn't quite place, something that suggested other places and languages underneath the perfect English. He asked one question, simple and direct, requiring only 3 words to cut through to the core of her desperation. "The car's there now." His eyes moved past her, scanning the street beyond the plaza with the systematic attention of someone trained to identify threats in civilian camouflage. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was tactical, gathering real-time intelligence to assess a situation he'd apparently decided deserved assessment. Leora shook her head, explaining her detour, how the gray car only followed her established routine between school and home. Tomorrow it would be back, she said, with the grim certainty of someone who understood patterns even when adults pretended those patterns were imagination, given too much weight. Ryan's expression shifted microscopically, something moving behind his eyes that might have been recognition or respect or calculation. He looked at her differently then, as though she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking, demonstrating competence in observation and strategy that most adults never bothered to develop. He asked her address without preamble, and when she recited it, apartment 7B on Fairmont Street, one of his security team pulled out a phone and began typing with efficient speed. No one questioned why they were taking orders from a 7-year-old's account of danger, which told Leora more about Ryan's authority than any reputation whispered in laundry rooms ever could. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said finally, each word deliberate as a chess move. "You walk your normal route home from school. Don't change anything. Don't look around for help. Don't do anything different than you've done the previous 8 days." The instruction should have been terrifying, but something in his tone transformed it into strategy rather than abandonment. Leora nodded slowly, understanding blooming like cold flowers in her chest. She was being asked to be bait, but bait in a trap designed by someone who apparently took the concept of traps very seriously. Ryan gestured toward the black sedan, and the rear door opened as though operated by invisible hands. He didn't offer reassurance, didn't make promises about protection or justice, didn't soften the reality that she'd just involved herself in something that operated outside the systems that had already failed her. Instead, he simply said, "We'll get you home now so your mother doesn't worry." The statement was practical rather than kind, acknowledging Avelra's existence and concern, without pretending this was about anything other than the calculated response to a legitimate threat that official channels had chosen to ignore. Leora climbed into the sedan's leather interior, her backpack clutched against her chest like a shield against luxury she'd never experienced. The door closed with the solid thunk of German engineering, and through the tinted window she watched Ryan speak briefly to his security team before sliding into the front passenger seat. The drive to Fairmont Street took 12 minutes through evening traffic, the sedan moving with the confidence of a vehicle that never doubted its right to occupy any lane it chose. Leora sat in silence, watching familiar streets transform into something different when viewed from behind bulletproof glass and institutional power. The 9th afternoon arrived with cruel punctuality, the school bell releasing students into sunshine that felt like mockery against Leora's mounting dread. She walked through the front gates with manufactured normalcy, her backpack positioned exactly as it had been every other day, her stride neither hurried nor hesitant despite every nerve screaming to run. 3 blocks passed in excruciating slow motion, each step carrying her closer to the intersection where the gray sedan always materialized. She forced herself not to scan parked cars or look over her shoulder, following Ryan's instructions with the discipline of a soldier entering combat. The gray car appeared right on schedule, emerging from a side street with the precision of choreographed menace. It fell into its familiar pattern, maintaining that careful distance that had defined 9 afternoons of psychological warfare, disguised as coincidence. The driver's silhouette visible through the windshield like a shadow, learning to take solid form. Leora's breathing turned shallow, but she kept walking, kept pretending she didn't notice the predator pacing her retreat toward home. The September heat felt oppressive suddenly, sweat forming at her temples that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with being prey consciously refusing to bolt. Then the black sedan appeared from the opposite direction, its presence transforming the suburban street into something resembling a stage where invisible spotlights had just illuminated the principal actors. It didn't speed or swerve, simply existed with such undeniable authority that 2 other vehicles pulled to the curb as though making space for something they instinctively recognized as dominant. Ryan emerged before the car fully stopped, his movements economical and purposeful. He crossed the street with measured steps that somehow covered distance faster than rushing would have, his attention fixed entirely on the gray sedan that had frozen mid-crawl. The driver's expression shifted from confident familiarity to confusion to something approaching genuine fear in the span of 3 heartbeats. His hand moved toward the gear shift, instinct urging retreat, but Ryan reached the vehicle before escape became possible and placed one hand flat against the hood. From his jacket's inner pocket, he withdrew a manila envelope with the thickness of substantial contents. He set it carefully on the hood directly in front of the windshield, his movements deliberate as a chess player positioning a piece for checkmate, then stepped back precisely 2 feet and waited. The driver sat paralyzed for 7 seconds. Leora counted them, before finally reaching through the window to retrieve the envelope with a hand that visibly shook. His fingers fumbled with the clasp, tearing the paper in his haste to understand what documentation had just landed in his possession, like a judgment delivered without trial. Inside were photographs, printed on high-quality paper that captured every detail with courtroom clarity. The gray sedan at various intersections, timestamps visible in the corners, showing 9 consecutive afternoons. The driver's face in profile, then straight on, then from an angle that revealed a birthmark on his left jaw. More images followed in sequence. Leora's school, her walking route marked on a printed map with red annotations showing where the vehicle had positioned itself, license plate numbers, vehicle registration details, and what appeared to be screenshots from traffic cameras that somehow captured moments official channels had claimed didn't exist. The driver's face drained of color as he shuffled through evidence compiled with professional thoroughness. His hands shook harder, the photographs nearly slipping from fingers that suddenly seemed unable to maintain grip on paper that documented his transformation from anonymous threat to catalogued predator. On the back of the final photograph, someone had written in precise handwriting that suggested expensive education and absolute confidence. The error already has witnesses. The sentence was simple, almost elegant, carrying implications that extended far beyond its 9 words, into territories where mistakes became permanent entries in ledgers maintained by people who never forgot. Ryan hadn't spoken a single word. He stood in the middle of the residential street with his hands in his pockets, looking less like someone delivering threats and more like a businessman completing a routine transaction that happened to involve the systematic dismantling of another person's sense of safety. The entire block had gone silent, the kind of quiet that descends when something significant occurs, but nobody quite understands what they've witnessed. Curtains twitched in windows. Mrs. Brennan stood frozen halfway to her mailbox, and somewhere a dog that had been barking stopped mid-sound as though the air itself had changed texture. The driver tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suddenly realizing the water had disappeared. Whatever words he'd intended died before reaching sound, strangled by the realization that explanations and excuses held no currency in this particular economy of consequences. Ryan finally moved, walking around to the driver's side window, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already won before the confrontation began. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face level with the man whose afternoon routine had just imploded, and spoke in a voice pitched for an audience of 1. Whatever he said lasted less than 10 seconds, but the driver's expression transformed from fear into something closer to existential horror. His eyes widened until white showed all around the irises, and his breathing turned rapid and shallow like someone experiencing the early stages of panic that logic couldn't quite override. Ryan straightened, adjusted his cuffs with casual precision, and walked back to the black sedan without looking back. The message had been delivered, received, and apparently understood with the clarity of someone who'd just glimpsed the machinery underlying Lexington's polite surface, and realized how thoroughly he'd miscalculated his own position within it. The gray car's engine started with a sound like mechanical sobbing, then pulled away with none of its previous predatory patience. It accelerated through the intersection without stopping fully at the sign, desperate distance replacing calculated proximity, fleeing from a street that had transformed from hunting ground into crime scene without a single act of physical violence. Leora stood exactly where she'd stopped when the black sedan first appeared, her backpack still clutched against her chest. She watched the gray car disappear around the corner with speed that suggested its driver wouldn't be returning to this neighborhood, these streets, or possibly this entire quadrant of the city. Ryan paused before returning to his vehicle, turning to look at her with that same assessing attention he'd given her on the plaza steps. He nodded once, acknowledgement rather than reassurance, then climbed back into the sedan that pulled away with the same quiet authority it had arrived with. The block remained frozen for another 30 seconds, before normal sounds gradually returned. Mrs. Brennan completed her journey to the mailbox, though her hands trembled slightly as she sorted envelopes. Someone's television turned back on mid-commercial, and the dog resumed barking but with less enthusiasm. Leora walked the remaining 2 blocks home in a daze, her legs operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to process what she'd witnessed. The photographs meant surveillance, which meant someone had been watching her walk home long before she'd climbed those plaza steps, either because Ryan's organization monitored the city more thoroughly than she'd imagined, or because he'd taken her seriously enough to deploy resources immediately. Either possibility suggested systems and capabilities that existed in spaces between official authority and criminal enterprise, operating with efficiency that made police reports and school counselors seem like children playing dress-up with toy badges. The gray car had been stopped not with arrest warrants or intervention programs, but with the simple demonstration that invisibility was an illusion. She climbed the stairs to apartment 7B slowly, each step giving her time to construct the explanation she'd need to provide to her mother. The truth seemed both too simple and too complicated. A man had been following her, and now he wasn't. And the mechanism of that transformation involved forces she didn't fully understand, but had deliberately invoked. Evelra was home early for once, her shift having ended at 4 instead of midnight due to hospital staffing rotations that occasionally aligned in her favor. She stood in the kitchen making sandwiches with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned to multitask survival, and her expression when Leora entered carried the specific worry of a mother who'd spent the day wondering if her daughter's fears were real. The explanation came out in a rush, the gray car appearing again, the black sedan intervening, the envelope and photographs and the driver's terrified retreat. Leora left out certain details, the parts involving plaza steps and calculated bait, editing her account into something approaching acceptable maternal comprehension while preserving the essential truth that the threat had been neutralized. Avelra listened with growing alarm that shifted into confusion, then landed somewhere near disbelief, mixed with relief. She asked questions that Leora answered as honestly as possible, given the parameters of what she'd chosen to share, watching her mother's face cycle through emotions before finally settling on exhausted gratitude. That evening, they ate sandwiches in silence, broken only by the sound of traffic outside and the upstairs neighbor's television playing game shows through ceiling that transmitted sound too efficiently. Avelra kept glancing at her daughter with the expression of someone reassessing a child who'd apparently navigated adult waters without permission or supervision, achieving results that official channels had dismissed as unnecessary. The gray sedan never returned, its absence as noticeable as its presence had been during those 9 calculated afternoons. Leora walked home from school the next day with cautious optimism, her route taking her past the intersection where confrontation had replaced stalking, where power had been demonstrated without a single raised voice. The neighborhood remembered. Mrs. Brennan nodded when Leora passed her yard, the gesture carrying weight beyond simple acknowledgement. Other residents she'd never spoken to seemed to track her progress with peripheral attention, their awareness suggesting that word had spread through the invisible networks that connected houses and families. Lexington's local news ran a story 3 days later, buried in the metro section where uncomfortable truths lived alongside grocery store openings. A man had been arrested on multiple charges: unlawful surveillance, stalking, attempted child endangerment, following an anonymous tip that provided prosecutors with documentation so thorough it essentially prosecuted itself. The article mentioned security footage from traffic cameras that had somehow been compiled and delivered to the district attorney's office in a package bearing no return address. It noted the unusual completeness of the evidence, how every potential defense had been preemptively dismantled by the methodical collection of irrefutable proof. Reading between carefully neutral lines, Leora understood that official authority was accepting credit for a case solved by unofficial intervention. The system was taking a bow for work, performed by forces it refused to acknowledge, preserving the comfortable fiction that justice flowed through proper channels rather than around them when those channels proved inadequate. Her teacher mentioned the arrest during morning announcements, framing it as proof that the school took student safety concerns seriously and worked closely with law enforcement to address potential threats. The irony tasted bitter in Leora's mouth. The same counselor who'd dismissed her reports now accepted praise for vigilance that had manifested only after someone outside the system forced action. Other students looked at her differently, though she couldn't determine if they knew she'd been the intended victim, or if they simply sensed something had changed in the social architecture surrounding her. Whispers followed her through hallways, not malicious but curious, the way children responded to peers who'd somehow touched something mysterious and returned altered. The black sedan appeared across from Ridgemont Elementary on the 4th afternoon, parked in a loading zone that normally meant tickets, but apparently meant something different when the vehicle in question carried weight beyond its physical presence. It remained there until Leora emerged, then followed her home at a distance that felt protective rather than threatening. She never saw the driver clearly through the tinted windows, but the message was unmistakable. She was being watched still, but by different eyes with different intentions. The surveillance had shifted from predatory to guardian, a distinction that mattered more than she'd understood when fear had been her constant companion. The pattern continued for a week, the sedan materializing each afternoon and disappearing once she safely entered her building. Other parents noticed and speculated, their conversations at pickup full of theories about unmarked police protection or witness security protocols, none of them landing on the truth that protection could come from sources the PTA would never invite. Avelra worked double shifts that week, her schedule returning to the brutal normal that paid rent, but sacrificed presence. Leora came home to empty apartments and microwave dinners, but the loneliness felt different now, less like abandonment, and more like the practical reality of survival that required her mother to be elsewhere so they could continue living here. She thought about the envelope on the gray car's hood, about photographs taken by cameras she'd never noticed and compiled by people she'd never meet. The implications suggested an infrastructure of observation more complete than anything she'd imagined, not just watching her specifically, but watching everything, everyone, creating an archive of the city's daily movements. The realization should have been disturbing, the privacy implications worthy of concern, but Leora had learned that theoretical privacy meant nothing when actual safety was compromised. that invisible observation by protectors felt infinitely preferable to visible observation by predators, whose intentions crystallized in slow-moving vehicles and knowing smiles. On Friday afternoon, the black sedan wasn't there, its absence marking the end of the explicit protection period. Leora walked home alone for the first time in 2 weeks, her steps cautious but not fearful, aware that absence didn't necessarily mean unwatched, just that the watching had returned to whatever baseline surveillance apparently maintained order. She reached apartment 7B without incident, climbed familiar stairs that no longer felt like approaching potential ambush, and unlocked the door to emptiness that felt like peace rather than isolation. The apartment was small and shabby, and safe. Existing in a city where safety apparently required bargains with forces that operated in margins most people pretended didn't exist. 2 weeks passed in cautious normalcy, each afternoon bringing Leora home without incident, but never quite erasing the memory of 9 days when fear had been her shadow. She developed new habits, checking behind her without paranoia, noting vehicle patterns without obsession, existing in the space between vigilance and the freedom to simply be a child walking home from school. The black sedan reappeared on a Thursday, not following her, but parked across from her building when she arrived. It sat there with engine idling, exhaust visible in the October air that had turned crisp enough to remind Lexington that seasons changed even when lives felt suspended in permanent aftermath. Leora paused on the sidewalk, her hand on the building's door handle, studying the vehicle with curiosity rather than alarm. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but something about its positioning suggested purposeful presence rather than coincidental parking. Angled to observe her building's entrance, positioned with clear sightlines to the street, she climbed to apartment 7B, wondering if protection was something that ever truly ended, or if it simply became invisible, woven into the background of daily existence. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead felt oddly comforting, suggesting she'd gained value in equations she didn't fully understand. Evelra noticed the car that evening when she returned from her shift, her scrubs rumpled, and her face carrying the exhaustion of 12 hours spent navigating medical emergencies. She stood at their apartment window for long minutes, coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the sedan that watched their building with the patient attention of something programmed for extended surveillance. "He's still protecting you," she said finally, her voice carrying notes Leora couldn't quite identify. Gratitude mixed with concern, relief tangled with the recognition that debts existed even when they'd never been explicitly named. The words hung in the air between them like questions neither knew how to properly ask. The sedan remained until 8 o'clock, then departed with the same quiet authority it always carried. But its absence felt temporary rather than final, a shift change rather than abandonment, suggesting that protection operated in rotations invisible to those being protected. Evelra made a decision that night, one that showed in the set of her jaw and the way she carefully ironed her civilian clothes instead of reaching for scrubs. She arranged coverage for her Saturday shift, a rarity that cost favors she'd been saving, and told Leora she had an errand to run downtown. The glass building looked different on weekends, its usual flow of business traffic reduced to security personnel and the occasional executive working hours that defied normal boundaries between professional and personal time. Evelra stood in the plaza where her daughter had sat weeks earlier, gathering different courage for a different kind of confrontation. She entered through revolving doors that whispered expensive engineering, her shoes clicking against marble floors that reflected ceiling lights like captured stars. The lobby receptionist looked up with professional courtesy that shifted microscopically when Evelra gave her name and stated her purpose with the directness of someone who'd spent years delivering difficult news to families in hospital waiting rooms. 20 minutes passed before she was escorted to an elevator that required a key card to access certain floors. The ride took her higher than she'd expected, past floors marked with company names she vaguely recognized, until the doors opened onto a level that felt less like office space and more like the kind of refined intimidation that money bought when it wanted to impress without seeming to try. Ryan's office occupied a corner with windows that transformed Lexington into a map of territories and possibilities. He stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair upholstered in leather that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But Evelra remained standing because sitting felt like conceding something she wasn't ready to concede. "I don't understand why you did this," she said, without preamble, her nurse's efficiency cutting through social pleasantries to reach the heart of her confusion. The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Gratitude, yes, but also the wariness of someone who understood that gifts from certain people came with invisible strings attached. Ryan studied her with the same complete attention he'd given Leora on the plaza steps, that quality of focus that made the person receiving it feel simultaneously exposed and genuinely seen. He moved to stand near the window, his silhouette framed against the afternoon sun that painted Lexington in shades of amber and approaching twilight. "Because no one else did," he replied finally, his voice carrying the same low certainty it had held when speaking to a 7-year-old desperate enough to seek help from someone the city whispered about in tones mixing fear and reluctant respect. The answer was simple enough to be either complete honesty or elegant evasion. Evelra absorbed this, her hands gripping the back of the chair she'd refused to sit in. She'd prepared speeches during the sleepless night before this meeting, constructed arguments and expressions of gratitude that now seemed inadequate for the reality of standing in this office with this man who'd deployed resources to protect a child he had no obligation to care about. "She could have died," Evelra said, her voice cracking slightly on the last word, as accumulated fear finally found release. The tears she'd held back during 2 weeks of aftermath threatened to spill, her professional composure fracturing under the weight of maternal terror retroactively acknowledged now that her daughter was safe. Ryan turned from the window, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but revealing depths beneath the careful control he maintained like armor. "The system failed her," he said quietly, each word chosen with precision. "Schools, police, the mechanisms supposedly designed to protect children. They all failed because believing her required effort and documentation and action." He paused, his gaze moving past Evelra to something she couldn't see, perhaps memories or principles that had shaped him into someone who intervened when others looked away. "I built my reputation on understanding that official channels work beautifully for people with resources and connections, but fail catastrophically for everyone else. Your daughter understood this instinctively when she walked to my building." The observation hung between them, uncomfortably accurate in its assessment of how power actually functioned versus how it pretended to function. Evelra thought about the police officer who'd dismissed Leora's reports, the counselor who'd suggested overactive imagination, all the small abandonments that had forced a 7-year-old to seek protection from someone the city's respectable citizens pretended didn't exist. "What do I owe you?" Evelra asked finally, voicing the question that had kept her awake more than gratitude or relief. She'd learned through years of survival that nothing came free, that help always carried price tags visible or hidden, and that debts to certain people became permanent entries in ledgers that compounded interest in ways that destroyed futures. Ryan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or recognition that this assumption was inevitable given who he was and what he represented. "You owe me nothing," he said with finality that brooked no argument. "Your daughter asked for help. I provided it. The transaction is complete. No debt exists." Evelra searched his face for deception, for the hidden clause that would activate later when she'd lowered her guard, but she found only sincerity that felt more dangerous than manipulation, because it suggested principles that operated outside the transactional logic she'd learned to navigate, creating obligations based on moral arithmetic she didn't know how to calculate. "Why?" she asked again, the question smaller this time, less about strategy and more about genuine incomprehension. She'd spent her adult life in a world where altruism was rare and usually performed for audiences, where help came with expectations, and kindness was currency spent for future returns. Ryan returned to the window, his hands in his pockets, presenting his back in a gesture that somehow felt more honest than facing her directly. "I have resources that most people don't, and power that I didn't earn through legitimate channels. Using those things to protect a child costs me nothing, and gains me nothing except the knowledge that one person is safe who wasn't safe before." The answer was both simple and impossibly complex, suggesting a moral framework that existed independent of profit or strategy. Evelra felt something shift in her chest, recognition blooming alongside gratitude. This man was dangerous, certainly, but perhaps not in the ways she'd assumed. His threat directed outward toward those who preyed on the vulnerable, rather than inward toward those who sought his protection. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Lexington's downtown sparkle like something from a postcard instead of the complicated city it actually was. Evelra's shift ended at 3, a rarity that aligned with Leora's school dismissal, allowing them to walk home together for the first time in weeks through streets that had transformed from threatening to merely urban. They passed the Corvell building on their route, its glass facade reflecting clouds moving across October sky. Across the street sat a small cafe with outdoor seating that Evelra had never particularly noticed before. the kind of place that served overpriced coffee to business professionals who measured time in billable hours. A cup sat on the corner table, steam rising in lazy spirals, despite the fact that no patron occupied the chair. Evelra recognized the cafe's logo on the paper sleeve, and something about the deliberate placement, visible from the building across the street, positioned like a signal rather than abandoned property, made her pause mid-stride. The barista noticed her attention and emerged from behind the counter, smiling with the particular warmth of someone delivering a message she'd been instructed to convey. "That's been paid for," she said, gesturing to the cup. "Every Friday at this time, there's an order placed for someone who might need coffee. No name given, just instructions that it should be here and available." Evelra understood immediately. The gesture's symbolism as clear as the photographs that had documented her daughter's stalker. This was acknowledgement without expectation, gratitude expressed through the kind of quiet observation that noticed when her shifts ended and created space for recognition that required no response. She accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, the warmth seeping through the cardboard sleeve into her palms. The coffee was exactly how she took it, cream no sugar, prepared by someone who'd either asked or observed or simply deployed the same thorough attention to detail that had compiled those devastating photographs. Leora watched her mother with understanding beyond her years, recognizing the significance of small gestures from people who dealt in large ones. The cup represented something beyond caffeine or courtesy. It was protection extended into the mundane, care expressed through the language of observation and anticipation that characterized how certain kinds of power operated when it chose to be benevolent. They sat at the table together, Evelra sipping coffee while Leora worked on homework that no longer carried the weight of fear about the journey that would follow its completion. Across the street, the building's windows reflected afternoon sun in patterns that obscured whether anyone watched or if watching was even necessary when care had been systematically embedded into routine. The following Friday, the cup appeared again. Same table, same time, same perfect preparation. Evelra claimed it with less hesitation, settling into a ritual that asked nothing except that she show up and accept what was being offered, without strings or expectations, beyond the simple acknowledgement that some people noticed when others needed small kindnesses. Weeks became months, autumn surrendering to winter's first cold warnings. The Friday coffee remained constant through seasonal changes, a persistent gesture that never escalated or diminished, maintaining its quiet presence like the protection that had shifted from visible to invisible, but never actually disappeared. Evelra never thanked him directly, never climbed back to that corner office to express gratitude that would make the gesture transactional. But the cup was always empty when she left, and sometimes when she passed the building on other days, she'd catch a reflection in the glass, a silhouette that might have been a man watching, might have been simple architecture playing tricks with light, might have been the ghost of protection that had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of their lives that distinguishing it from normal exes tense had become impossible. Leora grew older, and the story became part of her origin narrative, the time when she'd learned that safety sometimes required seeking help from unexpected sources. She'd tell it years later with the distance of someone who'd survived to gain perspective, explaining how desperation had led her to glass steps, and how that decision had altered not just her life, but her understanding of how power worked when wielded by people who chose protection over exploitation. The cafe thrived, its corner table becoming something of an institution, though the staff never revealed who paid for the standing Friday order. Lexington continued its daily operations, justice flowing through official and unofficial channels in the messy compromise that defined any city, honest enough to admit that order required more than laws, and enforcement required more than uniforms. And every Friday at 3 o'clock, a cup of coffee sat waiting, prepared perfectly, asking nothing, offering everything that mattered, the knowledge that someone was watching, someone cared, and some debts were never meant to be repaid because they existed in a different economy than the one most people understood. The coffee said everything that words would have ruined, maintaining the silence that characterized true protection. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to you. Until next time, remember that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places.